Should you upgrade to the new Sony A7C Mark II whenever that camera comes out? Well, so in this video, we're gonna be talking about why the Sony A7C Mark I is still a great buy even in 2023 and perhaps 24 and 25. We're gonna talk about those facts. So I'm gonna be breaking this video into photography and video, and we're gonna start with photography. The first thing that we need to talk about is the sensor that this camera possesses, and that one is going to be a 24 megapixel sensor, which in my opinion is the perfect resolution or balance between photo and video. Now in photography, you're gonna get great resolution, even enough resolution to crop and recompose a little bit in post, but the image quality that you get out of the sensor is really good, whether you shoot JPEGs or RAW. So the Sony A7C Mark I, it is also a great studio camera. Don't think that to shoot at the studio you need some sort of gigantic camera, because all it matters is the quality of the image that you get from the sensor and the lens that you have attached to your camera. So at the studio, this camera shines, and a lot of the times, my setup is either 3 to 4 to 5 light setups, and because we have a hot shoot right here, we can connect a remote trigger and fire as many strobes as your trigger can handle. So take a look at some of these images right here and tell me if you can tell if these images were taken with a Sony A7C, a 3-year-old camera, or the Sony A1.8 camera that costs around $6,000. Can you tell the difference? Now for comparison, I also want to compare the image quality of the Sony A7C Mark I with the Sony A7 IV, which is most likely the same sensor that we're gonna get in the Sony A7C Mark II. Take a look at these images and let me know if you can tell which image was taken with which camera. Now, one of the things that a lot of people are not talking about when it comes to photography is the importance of having IBIS in your camera. Now, the Sony A7C Mark I has mechanical IBIS, and it's nowhere near where, latest Sony cameras are at, specifically with a digital image stabilization, the active mode, or even the dynamic image stabilization from the Sony ZV-E1. But the mechanical IBIS from the Sony A7C is actually good enough to get you tag sharp images even when shooting with slower shutter speeds. Now let's talk about storage, and we all know that the Sony A7C Mark I has one single SD card slot, but chances are that the Sony A7C Mark II is also gonna have one single SD card slot. And an indication of that is that the Sony ZV-E1, a camera that is more expensive than the Sony A7C, actually feature one single SD card slot, and I think it has to do with the compressed size of all the components in this smaller body. Now, we all know the importance of having a lot of juice in your camera to power your photos and video throughout, the whole day. Now, the Sony A7C has great battery life, and it features the same battery as the Sony A1. So now another thing to consider when thinking about a Sony A7C Mark II with a 33 megapixel sensor is that sensor is gonna produce larger files, and producing larger files entail that you're gonna have to spend more money in your SD card. So in my opinion, if Sony would actually release the Sony A7C Mark II, I would like for that camera to have a 24 megapixel rather than having the 33 megapixel of the Sony A7 IV, thus giving us a better low light performance. Now let's talk about video, because clearly the Sony A7C Mark I was the camera with video creators in mind for several reasons. Number one, you have a 24 megapixel sensor, which actually performs really good in low light. But also when it comes to ports, you pretty much have everything that you can ask for. You have a microphone input, you also have a headphone jack to monitor your audio, you have a micro HDMI to record with external recorders, and you also have USB-C port for power delivery or data transfer. So I don't know what else we can ask for the Sony A7C Mark II. Maybe full-size HDMI, but for the fact I know that that's not gonna happen, knowing that the Sony ZV-E1 also has a micro HDMI. Now, an area where you may see an advantage with the Sony A7C over the Sony A7C Mark II is going to be in the heat department. Yes, This camera features the 24 megapixels, so it's gonna be a lot easier for the processor to handle that information, thus producing less heat. And remember the problems that we're having with the Sony ZV-E1 and heat. Now, there's no doubt that SLO3 10-bit 422 is gonna give you the utmost image quality when compared to SLO2 8-bit 420. But take a look at this video shot in SLO2 at 8-bit 420 in 24 frames per second with the Sony A7C Mark I. Now, one of the things that I like about SLO2 is that it's super easy to grade. Usually an S-curve takes care of the color grading or simply cranking the contrast and playing with some of the basic parameters in your sliders. Now, the other picture profile that I like, especially when I don't want to spend time grading, is HLG2, and the reason why I like it over the 1 or the 3 is because it favors shadows and highlights pretty much equally. Now, if you need to grade it, sometimes, the only thing that I have to do is just crank the contrast a little bit more and you're done. Now, when talking about video, we also have to talk about sound quality from this camera. And the Sony A7C Mark I features an okay preamp. I mean, if you ask me, the sound quality from this camera or the Sony A7 IV, in my opinion, is pretty much the same. And here's a test. And this is a test of the Sony A7C 1212 mic test. 1212 mic test. How does it sound? And this is a test of the Sony A7C 1212 mic test. 1212 mic test. How does it sound? And aside from all the video specs that we just mentioned, this camera also is great for gimbal work. Now, I like to use this camera with prime lenses when using gimbals, and these are the 3 lenses that I love from Sony. They're super small, super compact, and they don't entail me to rebalance the gimbal when using them. So the Sony A7C Mark I can still be called an A camera in 2023, specifically if you're coming from APS-C camera or older systems. So my conclusions are that the Sony A7C Mark I is an incredible buy in 2023, and perhaps it's going to still be an incredible buy in 2024. Now, this day you can get this camera used on eBay for as low as $1,100. I've seen it, and you can get it used sometimes for $1,400, $1,450. It's a lot of camera for the money. Number one, it's going to be great for photos and video. It's pretty much complete in both areas. You have an EVF, you have a flip-out screen, so you're gonna be able to film videos and monitor yourself. We do not have the touchscreen menus, but I mean, that hasn't stopped me from creating content with this camera, and it is a super compact camera that you can take everywhere. So if you own a Sony A7C, let me know in the comments down below what do you think, and if you're planning to upgrade, tell me why. And until then, guys, I will see you in the next video.